Walter, I am really focused on understanding free will in order to understand consciousness, what human life is all about. I hear from different views from neuroscientists, philosophers, but how about just rolling it back? We have free will, this phrase we use. What is free and what is will?
Well, those are very difficult questions to answer, partly because they're so abstract, but partly because there's so much cultural baggage and so much emotion tied into it all that I think it's useful to think about very different kinds of cases without that emotional baggage. So you're at a hotel and there's some pens on the desk and you go, "Are those pens free?" And the person goes, "Yes." What does that mean? That means they don't cost anything. Or you go to a restaurant, you say, "Is that seat free?" It doesn't mean, is it determined? It means, is there anybody else who's reserved that seat? Can I use it? So I take free to mean there's no barrier of the relevant sort, or no constraint, maybe one would put it that way, of the relevant sort. And then, of course, which are the relevant barriers, which are the relevant constraints? That's going to vary from situation to situation. Sometimes the relevant barriers are the cost. Sometimes the relevant barriers are the reservations. And when we're talking about freedom in the context of free will and free action, we're talking mainly about physical barriers or psychological barriers to doing the things that you want to do. And to say that you're free to do it is then to say there are no relevant physical or psychological barriers to you doing the thing you want to do.
So the classic critical question is to say, could you have done something otherwise? Now, that's a further analysis that's required.
Right, but notice the word could doesn't really help. People seem to think it's clear what counts as could and what counts as could not. But you might say, "Oh, can you come to the movie with me tonight?" "No, I can't come. I've got to work." Well, it's not that it's physically impossible. It's that it would be too costly for me because I need to get this work done. So even the word could has this to say you can do something is again to say there's no relevant barrier or constraint.
The key is relevant there because in each circumstance you have to determine what's the relevant barrier that defines freedom.
Right. And that's going to depend on what your interest is, right? If your interest is whether or not to hold someone responsible, for example, then certain kinds of barriers are going to be deemed relevant. It might be relevant that the person is delusional, doesn't know what they're doing. It might be relevant that they are locked into their room. That's why they couldn't leave and get to work in time. Whereas the fact that it's caused in a certain way in your brain, I think would not be relevant. I see no reason to think that that kind of barrier, that you're wired up in such a way that you want to do what you're doing, and you're doing it because you want to do it. If the barrier is you don't want to do otherwise, if that's the only thing that keeps you from doing otherwise, then there might be some sense in which you can't, but not any sense that's really important if the context is about whether to hold the person morally responsible.
So you would have a fundamental difference between can't mean literally I'm tied to a chair so I can't do something, and can't because the history of my brain patterns is such that it's going to produce this desire.
Right, because after all, our desires are lodged in our brains. They are patterns in our brains that lead us to do the things that we do. And so to say that the wiring of my brain is what caused me to do it is just another way of describing the same situation as I'm doing it because I want to do it.
So you're not adding anything by making that analysis.
Exactly. So if it's only the wiring of your brain that's leading you to do it, and if that wiring is the kind of wiring that reflects your desires and the kind of person you are, then to say, well, since it's just the wiring in your brain, you're not responsible, is just a trick. It might sound like it's a verbal ploy, but really, I think it's the other side that's doing the verbal ploy when they say, since it's your brain, it's not really you and you can't be held responsible. Well, your brain just is you. That's where your desires are. And to say that your brain made you do it is, at least in many cases, to say that you did it because you wanted to. And if you put it that way, it's clear why you're being held responsible.
Okay, so let's go from free to will. How can we analyze will so we have a deeper understanding of what that means?
Again, I think it's always useful to think not about what the thing is, but about what it's not. So what do we want to contrast will with? Let's take a simple example. I'm a golfer, and I might want to play golf this afternoon. And that want or desire is one thing, okay? Then I might plan to play golf. I call up my golfing buddy David, and I say, let's play golf. He goes, sure, meet you there at 3 o'clock. And now I've got a plan. I make a tee time. I put my clubs in the back of the car. I planned it all out. And at that point, I intend to play golf because I've got this plan. But I haven't made the decision yet when I actually decide to play golf is, at least in the sense that's relevant to free will, when at that last moment I'm addressing the ball and I pull the club back and now I'm committed. And now I'm committed to actually doing it and teeing off on the first hole. So I can have a plan about hooking it around the corner. But until I actually do it, I haven't willed to hit that ball.
You've willed to have a plan, though.
Oh, I've willed to have a plan, sure, but I'm talking about willing to do the action of hitting the ball, right? Then, did I freely swing that way? Well, I freely swung at that moment rather than earlier or later, because if I wanted to swing earlier, I could have, and if I wanted to swing later, I could have. But, of course, my brain was wired in such a way that I would swing at just that point, right? Well, if I want to swing at that point, and I choose to swing at that point, and I do swing at that point because I wanted to and chose to, then it seems to me I did it freely. And I'm not allowed to turn to my partner and say, wait a minute, my brain made me do it, and I knocked it out in the woods, I get another shot. No. So I'm responsible because I chose it, and I did exactly the way I wanted to.
So what's the consequence of this, particularly in juxtaposition with other philosophers who come up with different views of what free will is? What should I conclude from what you've just told me?
Well, I think what you should conclude is that philosophers are often confused, as if you didn't already know that from all of your experience talking to them. But they're confused on this issue in a particular way. They haven't gotten clear about exactly what they mean by free. So some philosophers say, if you're determined by the former states of the world, then you're not free. And I want to say, well, there's a sense in which that's right. And there's a sense in which that's wrong. So there's this big debate between the compatibilists and the incompatibilists. And the incompatibilists say freedom is not compatible with determinism. And the compatibilists say freedom is compatible with determinism.
Which is what you're saying.
I want to say, well, in a way, you're both right. In a way, you're both wrong. Because there's one sense of freedom, freedom from causation, that's not compatible with determinism. There's another sense of freedom, freedom from constraint and ignorance, that is compatible with determinism. And so once we get clear about what we mean by freedom, then we can ask, are wills really free in that sense that we care about? And the answer is they're free in one sense and they're not free in the other sense. And now it comes down to, well, what are you going to make out of the fact that this will is caused? And I want to say, in the end, you can't make much. Because when I choose to swing that club at that point, it might be a mistake. I shouldn't have been hitting that way. But I'm the one who chose to do it, and I'm responsible for it. And I'm not going to get another shot off the first tee simply because my brain made me want to do it.